Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning. Welcome to the Department of Toxic Substances Control's public workshop on regulatory responses for spray polyurethane foam systems. My name is Chen Xiao, and I'm a public participation specialist with DTSC and will be facilitating this workshop. During this workshop, please use the Q&A feature to type in your comment or question. Use the raise hand feature if you wish to make a comment or ask your question verbally. Instructions will be given later for those of you who are calling in. Next slide, please. Today's agenda includes this introduction and overview, opening remarks by Carl Palmer, Safer Consumer Products Deputy Director. The workshop presentation will be presented by Dr. Kelly Grant, Senior Environmental Scientist. A question and answer plus public comment period. Lastly, closing remarks by Jen Jackson, Safer Consumer Products Branch Chief. Today's presentation slides will be available on the Safer Consumer Product or SCP's workshop and upcoming events webpage after today's workshop. The recording of today's workshop will be posted to the SCP website. Please join me now to welcome SCP's Deputy Director, Carl Palmer. Carl?
Thanks, Chen. Good day, everybody. Thanks for being here and welcome to our workshop. I'm going to be brief. We're excited to have this workshop today as it represents a major milestone for us. This will be the first workshop we've had on our first regulatory responses that we are implementing under the Safer Consumer Products regulations. It's been a long journey to get here today, and the journey's not over. Our primary purpose for this workshop is to share information. And you'll hear shortly from Dr. Kelly Grant about the proposed regulatory responses and our rationale for those and details on implementation. But importantly, this is also an opportunity for us to hear from you. And I want to highlight that we'll have time today to answer questions and field some comments. But I want to note that we have a formal comment period that is open through January 12th. And you can go to our website and you'll see the links later on of how you can provide comments to us. And I would really encourage you to use that mechanism because it's very helpful for us to see things in writing. And when you make a comment or a suggestion, it's also important for us to understand the rationale for that. So rather than just tell us what you think we should do, please tell us what you think we should do, why we should do it, and any data or analysis that you have supporting that recommendation. Throughout our entire process of implementing this program, we've really put a lot of stock in being open and transparent about our thinking. And we've also been very clear that we need input from all the stakeholders to give us information so that we can make wise decisions based on our authority and responsibility. So I'm thanking you in advance for your comments and participation today, as well as submitting comments formally. Also want to just thank everyone at DTSC, Kelly, Jen, the entire team who've worked on this regulation and the regulatory response, and thank all of the stakeholders who have input. I also want to stress there's been a lot of good work done up to this point. So when you're making comments, please note, look at our regulations and look at the alternative analyses that were completed for SPF, as those are the basis of the information that we have in this process. So with that, again, thank you for your participation. Looking forward to today's workshop and moving it forward in this process. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Kelly Grant, who is our team lead for regulatory response and a senior environmental scientist here within the Safer Consumer Products Program. Kelly?
Thanks, Carl. I really appreciate that. And kudos to the whole team who's really done a great job putting together these regulatory responses. Carl already did a great job sort of prepping you about the purpose of this webinar, but just to, or workshop, I should say, but just to reiterate, I think it's really important that we solicit your thoughts and feedback. We extended the comment period through January 12th, so there's lots of opportunity for you to provide formal comments in the Cal Safer portal. And with that, I'll jump into the slide. So we're part of the Safer Consumer Products Program, and the mission of SCP is to advance the design, development, and use of products that are chemically safer for people and the environment. And the goals of our program are to reduce hazardous chemicals in consumer products and increase the adoption of green chemistry principles and safer alternatives to chemicals of concern in products. And we do this through this 4-part process. The first component is the candidate chemical list. This is the menu of chemicals that we can regulate. The second step is identifying priority products. These are product chemical combinations that can cause harm. In step 3, the manufacturers complete an alternatives analysis, or AA, where they evaluate the hazards and trade-offs associated with alternatives. And the fourth step is regulatory response, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. The goal of regulatory response is to reduce or eliminate the adverse impacts associated with the priority product, thus protecting human health and the environment. So today we're going to discuss the proposed regulatory responses for the manufacturers of spray polyurethane foam systems containing unreacted methylene diphenyl diisocyanates. That's a mouthful, so I will use the term SPF systems. And these regulatory responses will require manufacturers to provide information to consumers and users in California, to implement use restrictions that mandate training prior to the sale of the priority product, and to advance green chemistry and engineering by collectively investing $8 million to fund grants to develop or make progress towards safer alternatives. Details of these regulatory responses are provided in the Notice of Proposed Determination. So I want to give you an outline of my talk before I go much farther. I want to give you some background on SPF systems. I'll provide a primer on the SCP process and the timeline of SPF systems going through that process. Then we'll delve into the regulatory responses. Please note, from time to time, I might accidentally refer to these as RRs. That makes me sound like a pirate, so I try to avoid that, but I might slip and do that. When we start talking about those regulatory responses, we'll start with the principles used to select them, and then start with the required regulatory responses, and then get to the additional regulatory responses, the use restriction or training requirement. So before we go any further, I want to ensure that we're all on the same page regarding the priority product, or SPF systems. These are 2-component liquid systems. The A side contains the methylene diphenyl diisocyanate, or MDI. That's the chemical of concern, and the reason that SPF systems are listed as a priority product. The B side contains a mixture of polyols, catalysts, blowing agents, flame retardants, and surfactants. When the A and B sides are mixed together, they form the polyurethane foam, which you can see here, and it's used for roofing and insulation. It's particularly good at filling in voids and gaps. And these functions are all important for the energy efficiency of buildings. It's important to note that once the foam is fully cured, there is no longer a concern for exposure to MDI. MDI is reactive, and so any residual in the any residual MDI in the air would react and would no longer pose a concern. So the priority product definition includes 4 types of foam. There are 3 types of foam with different densities, 3 types of high pressure foam with different densities, and those are used by professionals as shown here in this picture. The highest density foam is used on roofs and exteriors. But there's also low pressure foam. This is primarily used by do-it-yourselfers or DIYers and workers who might handle small weatherization jobs. So these might be contractors or workers who weatherize windows. So now that you have an understanding of the product, I want to discuss how this product has moved through the SCP process, starting with the first step, the candidate chemical list. Methylene diphenyl diisocyanate, I should just call it MDI, that's easier, is included on the candidate chemical list because it's a very potent sensitizer, meaning that it can provoke allergic reactions in both the respiratory system and the skin, causing toxicity in those organ systems. So in terms of the potential adverse impacts from exposure to MDI from SPF systems, these include allergic responses in the respiratory tract and lungs, like asthma, and sort of similar allergic diseases or allergic responses. Allergic responses can also occur in the skin as well. And these allergic responses are mediated by the immune system. So that's another form of toxicity. In 2018, SPF Systems were officially adopted as a priority product because they met the 2 criteria required for a priority product listing, that there's potential exposure to MDI from the product, and that exposure has the potential to contribute to or cause significant or widespread impacts. And the primary concern for this priority product are workers who face potential exposures throughout the workday and who may develop asthma or a similar allergic condition in the lungs. So in terms of the timeline, in March 2014, DTSC proposed adding SPF Systems as a priority product. This was one of our first 3 priority products. In 2017, DTSC released the technical document, which detailed the potential for exposure and the potential for those significant or widespread impacts. In July 2018, SPF Systems were officially adopted as a priority product. And in August 2019, the American Chemistry Council, or ACC, sued DTSC over that priority product listing. In the same month, despite the lawsuit, the manufacturers of SPF Systems, also referred to as responsible entities or REs, submitted their initial alternatives analysis report. So that brings us to the third step in the SCP process, where the manufacturers or responsible entities complete that AA or alternatives analysis. And in the standard SCP AA process, typically involves this 2-stage AA, where the responsible entities, in this case, the manufacturers of SPF Systems, screen a wide range of alternatives. And then, if possible, select a few alternatives for more in-depth analysis. However, based on the alternatives analysis report provided by the SPF system manufacturers, they did not identify any feasible alternatives for all 4 types of the SPF systems. When that occurs, the responsible entities can also do an economic analysis and provide greater detail on performance parameters. And when they do all that, that equals an abridged alternatives analysis. And the abridged alternatives analysis automatically triggers 2 regulatory responses, where the responsible entities are required to provide information to consumers and advance green chemistry through research and development of safer products. So I'd just like to start or give you an overview of the SPF Systems Abridged Alternatives Analysis Report. The REs evaluated several types of alternatives. They did look at broader alternative insulations, but these were described as outside of the scope of the alternatives analysis. They also evaluated sprayable reactive insulations that do not rely on MDI. However, there was little information found on the ingredients and the performance of those types of insulations. And they also included alternatives that may reduce exposure to MDI. However, they found there were very limited options. For example, there was a patented nozzle that reduces exposure to MDI, but it was not portable and would not work for SPF systems. So the REs found these alternatives to be neither functionally acceptable nor technically or economically feasible. So to jump back to our timeline, we left off in 2019 with the lawsuit. And in October 2020, the responsible entities submitted their revised abridged alternatives analysis report. In February 2021, we issued a notice of compliance for that report. And in that notice, we suspended further activity on regulatory response until the lawsuit was resolved. In April of this year, the California Supreme Court denied hearing ACC's final appeal in the lawsuit, leaving the appellate court's decision standing, where DTSC prevailed in all 4 claims. Last month, we notified the responsible entities that we had resumed the regulatory response process. And several weeks ago, we issued the notice of proposed determination for regulatory response. DTSC has a number of possible options for regulatory response to reduce or eliminate the adverse impacts from the priority product. The first one is what we kind of refer to as a pre-regulatory response. And that's where we can require additional research to better inform the regulatory response process. In addition, DTSC can require that manufacturers provide product information to consumers about the hazards of the chemical of concern in the product. There are use restrictions on the product, on the chemicals or the product. We can prohibit the sales of a product. We can require engineered safety measures or administrative controls to reduce exposure. There might be end-of-life management requirements for products. We can also require that the manufacturers advance green chemistry and green engineering research. Guidance on selecting the regulatory responses comes from our regulations, specifically the very beginning of Section 69506. And preference is given to regulatory responses that provide the greatest level of inherent protection. And these selection principles are then binned into three categories. And the first is public health and environmental protection. And that includes the degree to which the regulatory responses address the adverse impacts from the priority product, the responsible entity's ability to act on the regulatory responses, and both intended and unintended impacts on sensitive subpopulations. We also consider the economic interests of the responsible entities, including any conflicting regulations on the chemical of concern, the cost of regulatory response compared to other regulatory responses, and the practical capacity of the responsible entities to comply. We also take into consideration the cost of government and efficiency. Those considerations include the cost of regulatory response relative to cleanup costs, the administrative burden, and the ease of enforcement. When the manufacturers complete an abridged AA, that automatically triggers two regulatory responses based on section 69505.4b4. And that says that manufacturers are required to provide information to consumers or users and advance green chemistry engineering by investing in research and development of a safer product. And I'll provide more details about these in the subsequent slide. So the overall goal of providing information to consumers is to make sure users have safety information before they purchase the product so that they can make informed choices. And this will help promote safe use and disposal of the product. And it will help users understand the hazards of the product and how to mitigate prevent exposures and avoid situations like this one shown in this photograph. So in terms of this reg response, we sort of grouped the information to consumers into sort of overlapping groups. And in terms of information that needs to be provided to both high and low pressure foam users, we want there to be product information on the label or nozzle cover, and that there will be a statement directing users to take safety training before opening the product. There must be an easily accessible link, for example, a QR code to access the training. There needs to be a graphic of the PPE that's required to safely use the product and prevent exposures, and instructions for safe disposal. Now, in terms of information for just the low pressure foam, which again is used by DIYers and workers insulating just small places or filling small gaps, like maybe contractors doing weatherizing. These systems need to have more explicit information because the users are less likely to be licensed professionals. And the overall goal is to create this quick start guide with that relies heavily on images and very limited text, and can help convey instructions and concerns to those Californians who do not readily read English. And so these the manufacturers would be required to provide instructions to access free online training, for example, using that QR code. Images of PPE is shown here. A hazard statement saying this product can cause asthma and allergic reactions and how to protect yourself. Instructions for, even though there is limited text, That limited text would also be provided in Spanish as well. And there's more that we couldn't detail in this presentation. For more information and the full breadth of the reg response, please see the notice of proposed determination. So the next required regulatory response is the advancement of green chemistry and green engineering. And the details are provided in section 69506.8, but we've provided an excerpt here. And the regulations state that when a manufacturer concludes that no safer alternative to its priority product is functionally acceptable, technically feasible, and economically feasible, the department may require the manufacturer to initiate a research and development project or fund a challenge grant pertinent to the priority product that uses green chemistry and/or green engineering principles to do one or more of the following: design a safer alternative, improve the performance of a safer alternative, decrease the cost of the safer alternative, and/or increase the market penetration of a safer alternative to the priority product. So the notice of proposed determination provides the details for this regulatory response, but I've tried to hit on the key points here. So this regulatory response requires the responsible entities to collectively pay $8 million into what we've named the Green Chemistry Innovation Fund, or GCIF. This will be used to fund research and development projects that can be proposed both by academics and industry. The GCIF will be administered by a third party, thus DTSC will never handle the money. An independent review panel of experts will select the projects for funding. With $8 million in the pot, we'd expect to fund 5 or 6 research projects, and the grants would last 2 to 3 years. This is sufficient to attract high caliber proposals with multiple approaches to develop safer products. When we spoke with experts, one of the most important messages we heard was that a diverse research portfolio would be more likely to have a successful project. And we want to be sure to fund multiple approaches to develop safer SPF systems. So how did we come up with the $8 million? Well, as noted in our regulations and supporting documents, the investment should be greater than the second stage of a 2-stage AA. And we estimate that to be about $150,000. And if we multiplied that out with 13 responsible entities, that's just shy of $2 million. But that's unlikely to be sufficient for 4 distinct products. And just a quick side note, when we had written many of our documents, we thought there were 17 and then 15 REs. We're now down to 13. So if you do spot any inconsistencies in that number, I just wanted to explain that. So as the regulations intend, the alternatives analysis is supposed to lay out information upon which DTSC can make decisions about regulatory responses. So the $8 million is partly based on the information in the abridged AA. The AA states that there are these 4 distinct products, and they estimate that the cost for research and development per product is somewhere in the range of $2 million. $2 million was not the highest number. It was sort of in that high middle range. And so we just multiplied that out to get 8 million. There's a lot more information on this in the investment in Green Chemistry Innovation Fund for SPF Systems document. So please review that for more details. We also consulted with experts, including green chemistry, policy experts, venture capitalists, chemists and chemical engineers, both from academia and industry. And $8 million was within their ballpark range to make meaningful progress towards a safer alternative. We've put forth criteria which all research and proposals would need to meet, and those include scientific merit, the applicability to spray foam insulation. We certainly know there's a lot of chemistry research into the many different uses and types of polyurethanes, and we want to ensure that this research would be applicable to SPF. We also need to know whether the product would be, whether the research would be achievable within the period of the research, the risk to reward ratio, the potential degree and speed with which the adverse impacts to workers could be eliminated, the potential for and proximity to commercialization, and the extent to which green chemistry and engineering principles are used. The final regulatory response is the use restriction from section 69506.4E. This restricts who may purchase or use the product. The REs are required to develop and institute a mandatory training program and ensure that all users of SPF systems have successfully completed requisite training before the sale of the product. The REs are strongly encouraged to subsidize the training for the workers. And the professional users are required to take a very rigorous training, safety training program. For example, the Spray Polyurethane Foam Alliance, or SPFA, training program meets the minimum requirements for professional users. So that training or an equivalent must be completed. Low pressure foam users must take free online training. An example of this is the Center for Polyurethanes Industry offers free online training, and that training meets the minimum requirements for low pressure foam training. So in order to monitor progress and compliance with this regulatory response, the manufacturers will provide an annual report that includes the number of new trainees, renewing trainees, and trainees that have moved up to higher licensure. The report will also include the total number of SPF workers in California, with estimates of new and continuing members of the workforce. The report will also include details about incentive programs for workers to take the training and the efficacy of those incentives. The report may also detail outreach efforts to distributors and employers to get them to verify the training status of workers before selling the product. So the next steps in the regulatory response process are really somewhat dependent on you all. We are going to synthesize the public comments and then use those to revise the notice of proposed determination to define the final reg responses. The regulations do not establish a specific timeframes for this process, so this will depend on the extent and the complexity of the comments. When we issue a notice of final we will issue a notice of final determination and work to reach agreement with the REs on implementation of these regulatory responses. And that final notice of final determination will include the deadlines to implement the regulatory responses. And we will also at that time issue at least a summary of responses to public comment. And lastly, once that happens, that triggers the RE's reporting requirements pursuant to this section of the regs, where they must provide information, they must notify their supply chain, as well as provide status updates to DTSC. So again, we'd really like you to engage with us through this process. And one of the most effective ways to provide comments is through our CalSafer portal. This will help ensure that we record your comments accurately and that they are efficiently added to the public record. We're specifically looking for comments regarding the implementation of these regulatory responses. For example, is the amount of money in the green chemistry RR appropriate? Are there ways that we could implement these differently so that they would be more feasible or more protective? Those are the types of comments that are going to be most helpful to us. The framework regulations underpin everything we do. So these are a great resource to understand our process. You're also welcome to sign up for our listserv to stay up to date on our activities at SCP. And feel free to email me if you have additional questions. Again, Chin already mentioned this, but we will post the recording, and our slides will be available on our workshops and upcoming events page. Some of you may be interested that SCP just celebrated our 10-year anniversary, and we invite you to celebrate with us by visiting our Decade of Safer Consumer Products Accomplishments page. And if you'd like to learn more about other DTSC projects, please visit our DTSC Green YouTube channel. And with that, I'd like to say thank you. We'd certainly like to start with clarifying questions, and we'll answer these to the best of our ability. We may need to take down your name and contact information so that we can provide a more thoughtful response. And once the once the questions seem to sort of die down, then hopefully we'll be able to transition to those public comments. Because this is an official comment period, we try not to respond too much to comments. And so I strongly urge you to submit those comments through CalSafer. And with that, I will pass it back to Chin. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. We will take this time for a Q&A session and take public comments. If you would like to ask a question, click the raise hand button and we will call on you. Please specify whether you are asking a question or giving a comment. Use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type in your question. Ask only one question at a time. We will not be using the chat function. If you are calling in, please press *9 to raise your hand and press *6 to unmute. So I'll go ahead and take the first question that we have in the Q&A. How many cases of MDI sensitization have been recorded in 2023?
That's a great question, and I don't know if we have that information at hand. Usually, cases of occupational asthma reflect a long lag period. So it's difficult to know what very recent exposures and recent cases of occupational asthma would be.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. The next question is typed in as well from Anonymous. Will there be enforcement and penalties to SPF workers or companies? What entity enforces the regulations?
Carl or Jen, would one of you like to take that?
Sure, I'll start. Well, we are the entity that enforces the regulations. That's the Department of Toxic Substances Control. The requirements that we have are for those people selling SPF systems into California. It's not directly to the workers. So if someone is out of compliance with the regulatory response requirements or any other provisions of our regulations, then we'll be pursuing that against the manufacturers or distributors of those products. Our focus is really for all these products on protecting the workers. That's our primary concern. And so that's the most direct answer to that question, I believe.
Thank you, Carl. So we have somebody who would like to state a verbal comment or ask a question. Ian, can you go ahead and unmute yourself and state your name and affiliation, please?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Ian Schwanier. I'm with the American Chemistry Council. The notice of preliminary determination to me reads more like a summary. There's a lot of unclarity there rather than a regulation. I was wondering what DTSC's anticipated steps are to finalizing the 3 distinct regulatory responses.
Well, maybe I'll start in, Ian. Yeah, the notice is not a regulation. It's a notice of our intent. As you're aware, those regulatory responses are required of each responsible entity, collectively or individually. And it's our intent and hope that we will work directly with those folks to enter agreements for implementation in the form of a cooperative agreement. Obviously, we have other tools. If that doesn't work, we can go to a more proactive enforcement mode if necessary, but there will be a dialogue on the finalization and how they're implemented and the provisions in the agreement.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Carl. So our question in the Q&A section typed in is from Lee Salamon. Some of the proposed requirements are not actions that can be taken by REs. How will these requirements be implemented by REs? Who is on the hook for them?
I'll go ahead and respond to that again. So thank you for your question, Lee. I think, and I'm projecting a little on your question. I think this would be one that would be really helpful for you to give us that question in writing with very specific examples of what you're talking about. But if you're, say, looking at the training requirement, the burden is on the responsible entity to implement that regulatory response. That may mean that there are impacts downstream that you can account for and address that are not entirely within your control. I understand, but so if other people don't meet a training requirement, then we would say that you can't sell your product to those people. So, but again, I'm not entirely clear on what you're specifically asking, so that would be really helpful to get that in more detail.
Right, thank you. We have an anonymous attendee asking a question. As a business using an SPF system in packaging our product, is DTSC considering any action we need to take other than what we already do for our employees under Cal OSHA?
So Unfortunately, I can't see all the Q&As, and I suspect I wasn't quite sure of all the terminology there. But the bottom line is that the manufacturers of SPF foam systems need to be responsible for making sure that your employees have that training. So I'm not doing a great job addressing your comment. I apologize, or your question. Carl, did you want to add anything to that?
No, again, I think getting more specifics is helpful. So yeah, I would just say if that's not clear, then give us more information and we'll do the best we can to address that. Let me cut in line a little bit too. I know that we got some questions about sharing the attendees for this meeting. And we recognize, I thought that people could see the participants, but apparently not. So we have our legal staff looking at that question. It doesn't appear that we're required to, or that folks are not required to disclose their personal information for attendance in this meeting. I understand people want to know who's participating. But we have a limited ability to do that. If we can, we will let people know after the workshop who attended. Another good point on that in terms of transparency is this is also helpful in making public comments through our CalSafer web portal. If you submit those comments, they are viewable to the general public, and you can view others as well. So we recognize that some people may have a question that or a comment that they don't want to vet publicly, but that's really up to them.
Thank you, Carl. We have a typed in question from Will Lorenz. And Will, I also see your hand raised. So I'll go ahead and read your typed in question first. Who determines if a proposed replacement is functionally acceptable, technically and economically feasible, and by what criteria?
Well, that definition or that terminology comes from our alternatives analysis. And I mean, our process for that alternatives analysis has been to evaluate the alternatives analysis. Did we think it was thorough? Did it do a good job on the hazard assessment? Did it really look at those broad sets of alternatives? And if it did, then it gets their notice of compliance. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is I think that in some ways it's the REs who do the AA make that determination. And I'm not sure if you're talking about going forward or back in the AA. It relates to the green chemistry RR. Carl, do you want to tackle that?
Well, I think you did a good job, Kelly. I think, Will, what I would say is that though we're not in the AA process right now, we're in the process of moving forward into the regulatory responses. And so that is a valid question when you're looking at what research is going to be done that can answer some of these questions, right? But again, there is a bias in the regulatory construct to require the manufacturers to specify what are the key and relevant factors in making a product that both works and can be safer. So there's not a canned answer to that in general. And one of the reasons it's constructed that way is to, now that the manufacturers have submitted and have approved a bridged AA, we're asking the next question of like, what can you do to fill some of those gaps based on that AA to advance and look towards can you produce something that is functionally acceptable, economically feasible, and technically feasible.
Great, thank you, Carl. So we have somebody with their hand raised. Stephen, if you can go ahead and unmute yourself and state your affiliation, please. Stephen, are you there?
Yes, I've unmuted myself.
Yeah. Hi there. Go
Hi,
ahead.
this is Steve Minority with Huntsman Building Solutions. I have a list of about 4 questions. Would it be helpful for me to go one by one?
Yes, please.
So my first question is, high pressure 2-component spray foam systems are an industrial product. The labels that we apply to our products are governed by US OSHA and Cal OSHA. Has DTSC reviewed the requirements of the OSHA HAZCOM standard to determine if any of the proposed requirements are duplicative or in conflict of federal or state law?
Sorry, I was taking notes and didn't unmute myself quick enough. David, do you want to respond to this?
Sure, yes, we have looked at these standards and we do recognize that there are some that seem duplicative. At the same time, the standards that we're asking for go a little bit beyond federal labeling laws and state laws, in that we're requiring some graphics and some information that's not yet there. And so these standards would apply to high pressure and low pressure foam, so that we are ensuring that we're communicating the standards that we think need to be met in terms of information to consumers on these labels.
And I would just add, Stephen, that as you know, we're not either, we don't desire and we're not able to conflict with state or federal law. But when there is space for additional information or work that we feel needs to be done, that is a space that we take action on it. And so we would be looking not to duplicate or replace, but to augment that existing information to meet what we determine are the needs.
Thanks, Carl.
Can you share that analysis with us?
I'm not, well, I think we can offline have a specific discussion. If you have a specific question, I'm not sure that we have a formal analysis of those requirements other than reviewing what's already there and then looking at what
there's no analysis of existing federal or state statute.
We haven't produced it. To my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, we haven't produced a document that says the analysis of the federal and state OSHA requirements versus what we're asking. But again, this is something that when we sit down in terms of implementation, that's where we can get into the details in terms of what the specific requirement would actually look like.
So my next question is, the documents mention some stakeholders and some folks that DTSC engaged in the process. Can DTSC go into further explanation of who you talked to, and will a complete list of who you spoke to be released? Because as far as we are aware, no one from our industry was contacted to provide any input to the documents that were released during the pre-rulemaking release of the documents.
Well, first, Stephen, can I clarify? Can you clarify? You're talking about what document? Are you talking about the notice of determination?
The notice and the Green Chemistry Investment Fund document reference outreach to experts, folks, I think was the word that you guys used, not my word, and several other opportunities that were availed to other folks that are interested in green chemistry, but I don't think anyone from our industry was contacted. So we're interested to know who you spoke to in the development of the Green Chemistry Investment Fund and the rulemaking, the pre-rulemaking documents.
Sure.
Well, go ahead, Kelly.
I guess I'm not sure, and I will defer to Carl on providing names, but in terms of the expertise that we sought out, we talked to a venture capitalist, we talked to some researchers who work specifically on polyurethanes and non-isocyanate polyurethanes. We reached out to folks who are pretty well known in the green chemistry community for promoting green chemistry innovations. So I can provide those types, and I will be honest, I'm not sure what we need to do in terms of providing clarity and transparency on that. Carl?
No, I was just going to add that I think that the documents itself reference the rationale, and we provide that information. We'll look and see if there's other sources of information we utilize and let you and make that public.
Thanks. It strikes me that there are at least 13 responsible entities that are experts in polyurethane chemistry, and it's surprising that those groups weren't contacted to discuss the investment fund.
Keep in mind, Stephen,
you're saying you're doing it now, Carl, but we're stakeholders as well.
Keep in mind, Stephen, that the primary source of this was the actual AAs provided by the industry, not something that we came up with on our own. So I would say that we did consult, maybe not independently or separately, but that we've been working on this with those entities and you for quite a while.
I don't recall being asked anything about research and design, but we'll move on. So the next question I have is, the proposed rule suggests that the green chemistry regulatory response includes that the manufacturers or the oversight group has to report back to DTSC about what went well under the program and what didn't go well, and provide some suggestions on how to improve the fund. And I'm curious as to what authority that is being mandated under.
So specifically, you're talking about the metric that we would require metrics for performance of implementation?
No, the board that will oversee the Green Chemistry Investment Fund is being mandated to write a report outlining what went well and what didn't go well with the grant program. And I'm curious as to where in the Safer Consumer Products regulation that is delineated.
So, Stephen, if I could just add, this green chemistry reg response is, I showed you pretty much the text of the green chemistry reg response. And so part of this involves us building this process. And my goal in writing that was that we want to ensure that we are doing a good job with this green chemistry reg response. And so if we could get feedback, not necessarily a written report, from the independent review panel, that would be really effective in helping us make improvements for next time. I don't think it was intended as a formal review of this entire process.
So that's something that the agency or the department would like, but it's not mandated by the regulations. That's what you're saying.
Well, what I would say, Stephen, is that our hope is that when we reach agreements on implementation of these, is that it's in everyone's best interest to say to what extent they're effective or not, and report on that publicly. This isn't a regulation we're issuing. These are going to be agreements that we hope will be cooperative, and so we can work through that as we go. If we have to, we can go the more regulatory enforcement route, but that's not our primary objective or our preferred approach.
So my next question relates to the actual funding of the Green Chemistry Investment Fund. Kelly, you mentioned that DTSC assumed that the cost of the funding should be greater than a stage 2 AA. My first question related to funding is why and how did you get to that factor? That seems very arbitrary.
So that is actually from our final statement of reasons. That is whatever subsection I referenced, I think it's 505B4, is that's covered in the that section of the FSOR. And the goal that's stated is that basically we don't want responsible entities to just say, oh, there's no alternative, I'm just going to do an abridged AA. So the regs or the FSOR set up an incentive to ensure that responsible entities do take the AA seriously, as you did, and really do a thorough job of looking for alternatives before they decide there are no technically feasible alternatives.
Okay, so why was so you said you would assume that the cost of the AA stage 2 would be about 150 grand. Considering the industry submitted one collective AA, why are you multiplying that by 13?
I mean, part of it is to ensure that we get to a meaningful amount for research. And collectively, or you did not necessarily need to do the AA collectively. That could have been done independently as well, in which case those costs would have been borne by each of the manufacturers. Carl, you're muted.
No,
Sorry.
I was just...
Sorry. Stephen, I just want to say, it's not our intent today to debate and determine the final regulatory response. I think your questions are good questions, and your comments would certainly be valued. So I would encourage you to put those in writing so that we can consider those as we move forward. So again, what we've put out is from our perspective, is the starting point. And that's why we're having this workshop, to hear from you about how you think we best should finalize these regulatory responses. So, but we've been very transparent about putting out what we've done and why, and that's why we're here today. And some of these things obviously might take some more discussion.
Thanks, Carl. I think I have one last question, at least for my first bite at the apple. And I'm curious to know what DTSC's thoughts are around regrettable substitutions or even equivalent substitutions. DTSC in its documents stated several times that the AA or the responsible entities had not done enough research into some of the potentially identified alternatives. However, the documents also note that many of these chemicals, based on the information that was available to the responsible entities, have similar hazards or equivalent hazards. So while you're encouraging additional research to be done on some of these products, what is a regrettable substitution? And is it simply just swapping one hazard for another? And if so, what problem are you actually trying to solve?
Well, Stephen, I think that, you're sort of going back into the AA framework, which is, I think, pretty clear in the regulation that there are a number of factors to consider. And I think one of the reasons that's there is that, you don't know what you don't know. So, looking as we move forward and look at the research for alternatives, you're going to have to evaluate each one on its own merit, right? And so if you find a chemical that's a drop-in replacement that works, but it has, similar or worse hazard traits and exposure pathways, then that might be a regrettable substitute. The devil's in the details. We're not pretending that we have the answers to that. We're just saying that in the considerations that need to be balanced as we move forward and as you do the research, that those are important.
Great. Thanks.
I think I actually have one question that you just sort of touched on.
Actually, Stephen,
in the AA, the responsible entities
Stephen,
that the map
can I put you? Stephen, can I give other people a chance to ask their questions and put their comments in? So if you can please get back in line, and I'll call on you later on.
Sure.
Thank you. And I just wanted to remind everybody that we are here to solicit comments, and specific concerns with the proposal should be submitted in writing, please. So next on the phone is Ian you have your hand raised again. Can you go ahead and lower your hand and unmute yourself?
Sure thing.
Thank you.
So Ian Schwanier, American Chemistry Council. The notice outlines 3 distinct regulatory actions, the concepts of which are pretty complicated and would require input from subject matter experts across the industry, including some that are not regulated entities. I know that the DTSC has given us a 60-day comment period, but when you take into consideration the holidays and people taking time off and the end of the year stuff, it's really much more than that, or much less than that. Would DTSC be willing to consider an extension to the initial comment period on the notice of preliminary determination?
Well, I mean, I think we'll consider any proposal you make. Can't make any promises. I would say that, on one hand, some of this is not news to anyone. The industry has known for years that since the initiation of the abridged AAA process, that at least 2 of these regulatory responses were going to be required. So I acknowledge that it's complicated, but I think, what you can give us a proposal and we'll evaluate that. But I want to make sure that we all understand that this is in some sense not news to most people.
No, it's not, but the details are.
Yeah, so absolutely. Understood.
Have somebody take a deep dive into that, or I'm sure most people would. And then secondly, would DTSC, and I know it's probably unclear on this, but would be willing to release another concept draft with a notice of preliminary determination for additional public comment after they've had a chance to receive the first set of public comments? Since I mentioned earlier that quite a bit is unclear, would that be something that DTSC would entertain?
Yeah, I mean, I think to be aware, I think Kelly outlined is that we're not bound on a time for, we're more interested in content and moving ahead effectively than doing it, so urgently. So if we get enough input and questions and comment that suggests that we need additional dialogue publicly and comment, we can do that. And so, yeah, I think that just depends on the merit of the input that we get.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So next with their hand raised is Doug Brady. Doug, can you go ahead and unmute yourself and state your affiliation? Doug? Okay. Then we'll go to the next person with their hand raised, Lee Salamon. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question or comment. Okay. We'll go back to the Q&A then. An anonymous attendee has asked this question. So if the RE provides the required training and the SPF employee suffers from sensitization as a result from their own actions, even though they received proper training, who will be responsible? Will the RE still be held accountable?
Well, I'll just say that's outside the scope of our, legal authority and perspective. It's a good question, but certainly our hope is that what will happen in the long term is that we'll have safer products and minimize exposures.
Thank you, Carl. And Lisa Massaro Kustuch typed in 2 questions. I'll read them both. The first one is, what is the measurable determination for quote unquote other languages that would be highly relevant to SPF system users in California? And the other question is, what if no replacement is found after 3 years and $8 million?
Thanks, Lisa. Those are really great questions. And in terms of the first question, we included that language because, we don't necessarily know the populations of folks who spray, who do the installation of the installation. And so if, for example, a SPF installer has a large population of, let's just say, Chinese employees, then they might request that information be made available in Chinese. But we frankly don't know enough about the demographics of all the SPF employees in the state. So, I mean, I think English and Spanish was our starting point, but if, somebody comes back and says, we know that, I don't know, some very high percentage of SPF installers are of a particular ethnicity or particular language group, then that might change what we'd like to see in the information to consumers.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. So, Doug Brady, I see you're back. You want to
Can I respond to the other part of that question?
So sorry
I
about
wasn't
that.
sure if Carl wanted to jump in and add anything there. But
Sorry
in
about
terms of the green chemistry grant, we recognize that research is a little unpredictable, and our goal is to make progress towards a safer alternative. But we can't guarantee specific research outcomes. We think we've set up criteria that will help drive the research forward and to make sure the research is meaningful. But research is research, and unfortunately, we can't guarantee that.
Did you mention, Carl, did you have something to add?
No, I'm good. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Doug Brady, are you back on? Okay. And Ian, would you like to go ahead and state your question or comment?
Yeah, I'm just curious, at the end of the green chemistry funding section of the regulatory response, the RR notes that manufacturers can opt out of participating in the Green Chemistry Investment Fund if they conduct research by investing equivalent funds to commercialize a product without MDI. If a regulated entity opts out, what does that do to the fund? Does the fund decrease?
I mean, I think as Carl has alluded to, part of this is conversations with you all to see how to best implement this. And certainly we'd like to have a reasonable amount of money to attract high caliber proposals. And so I think this might be a point of discussion. Carl, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. Again, it's a starting point. I think that whether it's done through that process or independently, it's our expectation that that information will move the field and the products forward. So, there's some inherent flexibility in this, and I think, as Kelly said, that's where, as we work through this, we'll be considering what works best.
Thanks, Carl.
Thank you, Ian, for your question. Okay, I'm going to try one more time. Doug Brady, are you back on?
Okay. There we go. Okay.
There. Hi, Doug. Yeah. Go ahead and ask your question or state your comment.
No problem. Technology-wise, this has been a pretty challenging piece. I think, I couldn't go off mute there. There was no way to do that. So, and I don't think we're seeing all the questions that are coming up in the Q&A. But into my question, and it goes back in, and I will submit some more of these in paper. So bear with me here. In the section on green chemistry, you go through several different analysis in terms of different sections and justifying the $8 million. And all of those analyses tend to be on the high end from each section. I want, and you've also talked about, which I appreciate, you wanting to have enough money to do responsible or reasonable research. But I would also assume there's some kind of capacity into which the value of the industry in California has to be played off on that versus the investment that's being asked on. And I want to specifically look at section F of that area, where section D and F kind of go together, but section F, where you're talking about that this is not a burden. You talk about the market share. Inherently in there's an estimate for the revenue of spray foam in California. It states in there less than $100 million. I was wondering kind of where did SCP make that estimate, and what was that level of investment is, because it seems significantly higher than what the reality is.
So, Doug, I can tackle at least the first part of that. Around $100 million came from the abridged AA. So that was information submitted collectively by all the REs. In terms of the burden, I'm sorry, I should have reviewed this document before. I'm not quite sure what section
you reference many times at the 3% of the annual revenue. And in that section, it's not $100 million, it's less than $100 million. Obviously, less than $100 million opens up a very, very wide range, of opportunity in terms of what it's looking at. And it's over 3 years, mind you, I get that point. But it seems that that's a huge, bandwidth in terms of less than $100 million. And looking at that in terms of where it could be, I mean, $10 million is less than $100 million. And the expectation is over 3 years, the industry earns $30 million. $8 million seems not fair and reasonable. So I'm kind of, I guess the wonder is what level of annual revenue for California did SCP use, and you're saying they used $100 million based on what was in the abridged A?
Yes, and that was based on, I believe, data from, or an estimate for 2020. So I would assume the market has gone up since then as well. If the industry has better information that they can submit, we would happily get that data.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and just to emphasize that point is, it's very difficult for us to get that kind of information publicly. And so we welcome your input on that. Our assumption is that when in the AA, when it was said less than 100 million, if it had only been 10 million, you probably would have said 10 million. But yeah, we're eager to get your input on that.
Well, I just add, kind of following up to Stephen's comments, if we were asked to contribute in terms of where the green chemistry number should be, like these other unnamed experts and folks, that might have been something we could have provided.
Okay, well, we're happy to get your input on that, Doug. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Next on the phone, Heather Trim. Go ahead and state your comment or ask your question. And could you also state your affiliation, please?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. I'm Heather Trim with Zero Waste Washington up in Seattle. So not in California, but what you all do there very much impacts what we have here. And I have not heard very many environmental voices today. I get it. Industry is going to be your bigger commenters today. So I just wanted to at least put in an environmental perspective, which is, we have a very, very toxic chemical with big impacts. It has gone on way too long. So I would not be in favor of further delays. And also, I don't know that that 13 million is a sufficient size fund to really make the change happen as quickly as it needs to happen in terms of getting to some non-toxic alternatives. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Heather. Stephen, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. I would also note that I would find it kind of bold to claim that everyone on the call is not an environmentalist. I personally love the environment. My question relates to new entrants to the market. How will this Green Chemistry Investment Fund be applied if a new market entrant comes into California in 2027, for example, and goes through whatever regulatory requirements are there? If they go through and they do their AA and they get to the same point, what happens? Will they be added to the fund? What is DTSC thinking about the fairness aspect of making sure that new market entrants are held to the same standard as existing companies?
Well, Stephen, I think that the general response is that our expectation is that there will be a level playing field for everyone in the market, and everyone is held accountable to the same regulatory standard. So depending on who comes in when and where they are, then we would require that they go through the similar process that everyone who already has gone through it, whenever that is.
The Safer Consumer Products regulations allow manufacturers or responsible entities to petition to be off the list in 3 years. So will this whole program then be sunset after 3 years and whatever point in the system that we are in at that time?
I'm not sure I entirely understand your question.
So if let's say we do our 3 years of research, we petition, we're removed from the Safer Consumer Products priority product list, then a new market entrant comes into California, they would have no regulatory burden at that time, correct?
If I'm correct in understanding your point, if you petition to remove spray polyurethane systems with MDI from removal from the priority product list, then yeah, if that was approved and that was not a requirement, then anyone entering the market would not be subject to our requirements if that was no longer a listed priority product.
Okay, thank you. And I have one final question about the concept of having multiple types of alternatives for each of the identified products, the 3 different densities and the low pressure systems. Does DTSC foresee an opportunity to have 4 different replacement chemicals? Is that what DTSC is expecting? Are they wanting research across all 4? The documents are vague and sort of confusing. In the AA, the responsible entities made a statement that the sort of broader economic and commercialization of MDI is important to the industry because it works across all 4 products. If that balance is thrown left or right by saying, oh, 3 products are going to use MDI and 1 product's going to use new chemical XYZ, that shifts the entire dynamic of our industry. How will DTSC look at that balance as it makes suggestions on research or works with the responsible entities in the Green Chemistry Investment Fund to approve grants or move the industry, quote unquote, forward?
Well, I would say, Stephen, that we're not speculating or trying to suggest that there would be 4 separate pathways. We don't know what those pathways might be. There might be one pathway that works for all of those or a variety of solutions. So it's premature for us to determine that. We're not making presumptions about that. It could go a lot of different directions, I think.
Yeah, I think you're getting you're focusing too far on the forward part of the question. I think my question relates more to the sort of broader economic impact of not using MDI across the entire industry if only one portion of the industry selected an alternative, or if one or two or three, it changes the whole cost structure of our industry. It's probably a complicated question for you to answer today. I just wanted to raise it so you can see what you pay attention to it as we respond to the public comment period. I don't think you really need to expand on it more than you already have, Carl.
Yeah, well, I'd be interested in you getting more specifics and a comment on that. Obviously, there's all kinds of factors that will be impacted depending on where things go. So,
and if I could just add, Stephen, our goal really is to make sure that a product gets commercialized. And it sounds like the best path forward for that is really to have an alternative that does work across all 4 products. So we are aware of that. And certainly in terms of looking at grants that can best address those all 4 uses would be much more favorably reviewed than a grant that only seemed to address one type of use.
Kelly, can you repeat what you said? I thought you said your goal was to force commercialization of a new product. I thought we were doing research to determine if something was feasible. Is the goal to do the research, or do you absolutely want MDI to be replaced in spray foam systems?
Sorry, I did not say we were going to force commercialization. That is certainly a goal of research. I mean, research that sits on a bench is not going to help reduce the adverse impacts. We want to make sure that a product gets out in the market. Are we going to force that? No. Carl.
Well, I'll sort of combine my response to, I see Lee asked the question about innovations versus replacements. And I think that, this from the get-go, what we aren't, we don't anticipate that there's necessarily a silver bullet that will work for a drop-in replacement across all products for all uses. We've learned, and with a lot of engagement with all of you, about the complexities of this class of products for a variety of uses in different scenarios, and some of those may or may not be amenable to some of the innovations that hopefully come out of this process. So, we're not presuming there's going to be a silver bullet that does all this and has hit the shelf and is marketable. That would be great if there was. But again, our objective is to minimize and eliminate, if possible, adverse exposures to people in the environment that cause harm. And I think that hopefully the industry shares that as well. And that's going to look like potentially a lot of different things. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and we recognize that. So, it's a process. And as Kelly alluded to earlier, particularly with research, we don't know where that might lead. And so that's part of the overall construct of our regulatory framework, is to say that if through the AA process there isn't identified an alternative, then do more research to see if there is one or more.
Carl, Kelly, I'll jump in here as well. And Stephen, to the extent that you can provide comments in writing that would help us understand some of your concerns here around research and make suggestions. We're open to ideas. We're open to suggestions on how we can structure this, how we can conduct research, where we should be going with this in order to make progress, because ultimately our goal is to find a safer replacement or an alternative. And that's what this research grant project is about. So to the extent that you can think through and come up with some suggestions that would help us, make this a better process for all of us to have a better chance of success. That's what we're ultimately after here in this process.
Thank you, David. Lee Salomon, I see that you're having difficulty unmuting yourself. I think you can go ahead and talk now. Did you want to state your question?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
We can hear you, Lee.
My God, how frustrating.
Sorry about that. Go ahead and
It's okay. I
ask your
didn't have the
question.
magic mute button on my screen. So thank you for unmuting me. I'm Lee Salamone. I'm with the American Chemistry Council. And I would have said at the top of the questioning period, had I been able to unmute myself, that I appreciate the opportunity for the two-way exchange. It is complicated. I've put several of my questions in the Q&A because I couldn't unmute. But I did want to ask so many questions. Your cooperative agreement approach is interesting as opposed to a strictly regulatory approach. And at this point, I'm just reading the question I typed in. Are you planning to execute agreements with all 13 responsible entities, or like we did with the alternatives, the abridged alternatives analysis with a trade association? A trade association is not a regulated entity. And if you have to execute them with each and every one, do they all have to be identical to each other?
Good question, Lee. Yeah, so much like with the AA process, each individual responsible entity is responsible and accountable for meeting the regulations. And there was great cooperation in that process. Our hope is that that would be possible for implementing the regulatory responses as well. We understand that's complicated, both legally and both because you're talking about folks that are in the same market as competitors. But it's an option that we think is potentially viable, and we'd be interested in seeing if that works. If not, we will and can, reach agreements or issue orders to each individual responsible entity. There are models that you might look at. I know like for the recycled battery industry, RBRC is a collaborative effort by a number of manufacturers that support the collection of recyclable batteries and the recycling. Again, we have some flexibility in how this gets implemented.
Okay, that's helpful. Can I keep talking since I have more questions?
Yes, go ahead, Lee.
Okay. We just spent the last few minutes talking about replacements and chemistry and safer alternatives. There are highly innovative and long-term companies on the phone. If any of them could have invented the next greatest thing that would be better than what we have for spray foam, they probably would have done that. And I think there was evidence of how difficult and intractable a problem it is to try to replace reactive chemistry with something that is not reactive. And I do take issue with never mind. But I wanted to ask about green innovations. We want our money that the members need to provide to this fund to be put to good use. And we'd like something good to come out of it. And we feel very strongly that research to limit exposure or something other than finding a drop-in replacement for MDI might be more fruitful. Is that come under the category of green engineering that you'd be willing to entertain?
Lee, that's a great question. And yes, that meets the criteria for the green chemistry and engineering grant. So yes, I think we understand that those may be a much faster route to protect workers. So those would be considered in scope for grants.
That's helpful. What if some of the manufacturers want to do some stuff and others want to do other things? Does the funding for green chemistry or green engineering have to be a single fund, or can you make agreements with some companies that may have a research thing that they want to do and communicate privately to DTSC, and others who want to do some other kind of program?
Yeah, I think we have a fair amount of flexibility. And I think that's the kind of details we'd be interested in what any of the responsible entities would propose.
Okay. I have a million other questions, but I'll stop.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank
and
you.
I'm glad you were able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, well, my mute button just showed up when you put it there, so thank you.
Awesome. Ian, you've been patiently waiting. Can you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question or state your comment?
Yes, thanks. A lot of the discussion has been on finding a replacement for MDI, but the regulatory response also mentions a green engineering route. And I believe that Carl briefly touched on it earlier, minimizing exposure. I was wondering how much Cal DTSC has looked into the potential green engineering route. I know this will probably be something that will be better for written comments, but was wondering if you all have considered much of a green engineering route, because I think that really gets at the crux of the issue at hand of minimizing exposure.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think that's a great suggestion. And I will say our information largely came from the information provided in the abridged AA. I know we had done some initial research and sort of prompted the inclusion of some of those green engineering or engineering controls, prompted their inclusion into the AA. So we have not done much research beyond that, but certainly these are within scope of the green chemistry and green engineering reg response. I tend to shorten it just because kind of a mouthful to say all those words, but yes, green engineering is definitely within scope.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, for your question. So we have Will Lorenz has typed in a comment. GC was not contacted on green chemistry funding levels or its research calculation. It seems SPF industry was arbitrary and perhaps capriciously overburdened on $8 million green chemistry fund. And
I just say thanks for your comment, Will, and we're happy to hear your suggestions for alternatives.
Thank you, Carl. Anonymous attendee, other than labeling that training is required before use, how will manufacturers be able to ensure downstream sales at multiple points down the supply chain are only made to trained users?
Well, I think I'll start. I think that's a good question. You know, our understanding is that the industry and the supply chains and channels are well understood by the industry, and those relationships are there. And so we would ask the same question as like, how are you going to ensure that? I mean, there are other products that have restrictions of sales from spray paint to otherwise that there may be some models out there that could be effective. We're open to suggestions.
Thank you, Carl. We have a question from Nima Tulaabi. The possibility of having to add a third language seems to not have been well thought out. Much of our label content is pre-printed on packaging inventory prepared way before the product makes it out of the shop. When and how do the manufacturers know of the need to add a third language to their packaging?
Well, just broadly, and Kelly can chime in, but I think you know, our feeling is the manufacturers are responsible for their product and the labeling that goes on it, notwithstanding the time frame it takes to create it or put it on the shelf. And as Kelly alluded to earlier, we don't have that much information about what the appropriate language needs are. You know, certainly our experience in other sectors, nail salons, for example, have very specific workforce that has very specific language needs, and that may or may not be the case. So we'd be interested in hearing about that and then working with the manufacturers on how to implement that requirement.
Thank you, Carl. We have a typed in question from Lisa Massaro Kustich. The green chemistry document states, little research in this area seems to have been completed since 2018. This may be because industry research shifted towards phasing out HFC blowing agents due to their high global warming potential. Why did DTSC assume the transition of foam blowing agents negatively impacted research related to the potential alternatives? What references does DTSC have for this assumption?
So, hi, Lisa. I will say that's probably a little overstated, but I think it's actually the lack of references that inform that statement. We've seen patents, we've seen papers that had come out earlier, and little new research that I've found seems to have come out since about that time frame. So if you'd like us to revise that statement, I would be happy to change that. Sorry, I don't know if I can say that. We would take that comment under advisement in developing our final document.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. Lee Salamone, you have your hand raised again?
Yes, now I have an unmute button. Thank you.
Perfect.
Some time ago when we submitted comments at some stage, we were at the same time speaking with Canada, Environment and I get the EEEC, anyway, their Energy and Environment Group, about two-component low-pressure foam kits that are used by do-it-yourselfers. And we have established a code of practice with Canada for the manufacturers who sell material there. And after some lengthy discussions with Canada and a discussion of appropriate risk management, they did come up with a program that they're comfortable with about the way that information on safe use for those kits is made available at retail. They did a comprehensive review of the exposure potential for people who generally buy that product, use it one time, and realized that we, the responsible entities, were not able to reach into the retail environment to police a restriction or to convince the retailers that they should participate in a program to, I don't know, check IDs or something. And so I just wanted to put that out there so that you're aware of it. We will include that in our written comments, but we found that to be an appropriate risk management response for Canada, and we do hope that you will consider that to be appropriate as well.
Thanks, Lee. That'll be helpful.
Thank you, Lee. So Chris Jansen typed in a question. The information to consumers is requiring drum seals to contain warnings and QR codes in multiple languages. These seals are only 2-inch in diameter, and the requirements would be illegible. What is the best way to interact with DTSC to ensure these requirements can be practically implemented?
Chris, thanks for your question. That was actually a suggestion that came from the abridged AA, that manufacturers could include some kind of tag or something on the bunghole covers so that folks could get that information really quickly. If we'd be happy to work with you to try to understand what the constraints are and figure out an appropriate way to implement that going forward. So I would say just reach out to us. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. Will Lorenz has a question. Did DTSC consider utilizing the state of California contractor license system for spray foam insulation or roofing installers to complete the industry MDI health and safety training?
David, could I call on you?
Yes, Lee, we did look at the Contractor State Licensing Board and to require that requirement of training prior to or for anybody to get licensed, but that goes on to the employer. It's a licensing requirement that would be difficult to get started and to implement. And that's why we're going after training the way we are, requiring the manufacturers to actually look downstream and to ensure that the people that they're selling to are training, or eventually the employers are training their employees. Cal OSHA under Title VIII has a hazard communication standard that requires employers to train their employees. But that hazard communication standard applies to lots of employers, industries in California, and numerous thousands of employers. And Cal OSHA just simply doesn't have the resources to go out and ensure that training is happening. And they rely on a complaint approach to address issues when they arise with employers. And so we could establish a standard as a part of licensure. However, that doesn't ensure that those employees are trained. And that's the reason that we're looking at the training program that we are through the manufacturers to establish a way to make sure that employees are trained prior to the sale of the product. Relying on Cal OSHA or a licensure requirement simply doesn't achieve the goal that we're trying to achieve with this specific regulatory response.
Thank you, David. I just want to take a moment to remind everybody that you can also submit your questions and comments to the Safer Consumer Products at dtsc.ca.gov email. And that Safer Consumer Products is plural at dtsc.ca.gov. We have a question from Tim Shestek. Is it DTSC's intent to provide more detail as it relates to the Green Chemistry Innovation Fund independent review panel, for example, process for selecting members, number of members? Will grants be awarded based on a majority vote of the panel?
Thanks for the question, Tim. Yes, as we work through this process, we will develop some more of the details associated with the Green Chemistry Innovation Fund and the independent review panel. If you have suggestions or comments with that, we would appreciate you putting them into CalSafer. Thanks. Or reaching out to us.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. I'm not seeing any more raised hands or typed in questions, so I'll just give it a minute for any new questions to come up. No more questions? Okay, it looks like that's it for the questions. Again, you can also submit your questions and comments after this workshop ends to the Safer Consumer Products at dtsc.ca.gov email. So if there are no more questions or comments, we can go ahead and have Jen Jackson. I would like to introduce Jen Jackson, Safer Consumer Products Branch Manager, to give our closing remarks. Jen?
Thanks, Chen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we
Great.
can.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone, for your participation today, and thanks to the staff and everyone who's supported making today happen. It's not lost on any of us that this is a very complicated process, and there are things that we don't know, and we don't know what we don't know. So we really appreciate the questions. This is why we hold public comments and public workshops so that we can get more information and daylight that information for all of us. So thank you so much for your participation. Again, we very much encourage you to transform the questions that you've had into comments and provide us specifics so that we can try to address those as we move forward toward a notice of final determination. Thank you again, and we look forward to continuing to engage with all of you.